We also will see this in Knapp and Evangelist's staircase model of relational development. And a lot of times they talk about this in terms of romantic relationships, but it also comes into play when we are working with others. We're going to initiate a relationship. We're going to start talking to somebody. And then we start experimenting by talking about some of the things we do, some of the things we like, seeing if the other engages. And then we start to intensify this. We start adding more and more. And then we start integrating and we start saying we, who we are, what we want to do. And then we pull it to a bonding. And bonding is a lot of times like in relationships when you would get married, or you would definitely say this is who we are. And throughout this process you're stabilizing. But Knapp and colleagues said that you sort of move up these steps, and then over time in relationships a lot of times you might move back down. So you may start differentiating. You might start having different opinions with things. So you may not necessarily always agree. You may go to a circumscribing stage, and then you may go into a stagnating stage where you just, that's what they think, I'm moving on, whatever. I'm going to keep believing what I believe. And then you get to the avoidance stage where I'm just going to avoid them because I don't necessarily agree, or I don't have that relationship with them. And then you terminate the relationship. So your model of relationship development, so as you open up yourself and you become more important, you also have to watch where you are in terms of relationship with people. Obviously your best communication is going to come up here in this bonding, this integrating, where you're really becoming one as a person and understanding each other and trusting each other. But as it goes down, your credibility may go down at some point, and then your credibility is going to go up as you're going up in the relationship. A lot of things with relationships, a lot of it is impression management. So how we manage the way people see us, okay? So how you see me, the things I let out, my sort of my self-presentation. And there's two theories that your book really talks about well. The first one is the sort of the face management theory that Goffman sort of described, and sort of this idea of self-presentation. You're trying to foster an impression to others. You put out a face. You put out who you want others to see you. You may hear this sometimes. I put on my work face when I go to work, or I put on my mom face when I'm at home. So it's this face management, what you want others to see, and the impression you want to give off. Brown and Levinson, however, took it a little bit further and said there's a politeness theory that goes with that face management. And a lot of times you'll put out a positive face when you desire to be valued and seen as competent. So you'll have a positive face that you're putting out. But you may also do a negative face where you want to be free of imposition and constraint. You don't want to have to worry about what others are thinking of you. Possibly if you're in a large crowd and you don't want to necessarily be bothered, you may put out a negative face because you don't care what others around you are saying or thinking. You want to do your thing. Where positive, you want to be valued, seen as competent. So maybe in a group situation, a work situation. As we think about mass communications, this really comes into play in putting our messages out there, sort of working through those models. And Bandura, this is one of the readings I think I gave you in terms of social cognition and sort of why we think about ourselves, why we think about others, how we think about others. Bandura did a lot of research, and there's social cognitive theory, which we'll talk about as we go on this semester, but there's also sort of social cognition, how and why we think about people, okay? So sort of self-efficacy. What is my self-belief in what I can do? I teach technology classes, so I have to have high efficacy and understanding that I know how to use this technology in order to put off the air that I know what I'm doing. Okay, so do I think I have that control and that ability to do something and that worth? And then my self-regulation, how I regulate how I see myself and how others see me. So we look at that, and a person's behavior tends to be influenced by and is influencing of personal factors in the environment. So my behavior can be influenced by the environment that I'm in, whether I'm with my family, whether I'm at work, whether I'm with friends. So my cognition and my self-efficacy and regulation of myself will differ based on the environment that I'm in and how I process some information. Sort of the encoding messages, the storage of messages, the retrieval, and how I apply them in social situations is going to depend on my self-efficacy, my self-regulation, and sort of the environment that I'm in. So we have to be aware that people are socially cognizant of who they are constantly and how they are portraying themselves in different situations. And one part of this will come into play is people's schema, the way people, that cognitive structure of what they think of something. So what is that structure? It represents knowledge about a concept or type of stimulus. We have different schema. We're going to talk about schema a lot when we get into media messages. But it's really important that we think about schema, our personal schema in terms of being outgoing. Maybe I'm abrasive. I see these things. Maybe I have a social schema of that I'm wanting love out of this situation. And so I'm going to guide myself, guide my memory, guide my judgments to find that love in this relationship. Or maybe it's revenge, and I'm going to do things and present myself in ways to show this revenge. So we've got this sort of personal schema of who I am, what I believe I am, where I want to go with that social, and then sort of my role in that situation. So am I a graduate student in this situation is going to affect my cognitive structure and how I look at the information being presented to me. Well, I look at, if you give me research, am I going to look at it as maybe it's research on food production. Do I look at it as a parent of a child, or do I look at it as a researcher and look at, the reliability, the validity, or do I just take that pathos and that emotional as a parent, which track am I going to take? And we'll look at that a lot when we talk about media. So schema is the other thing. Schema is going to really guide your memory and your judgments. We tend to remember things that follow our schema, that enforce what we believe. Okay, so there's schema versus evidence, and when we are given evidence against our schema, so if you try and come up against me when I'm trying to love on you and you're trying to be mean to me, that's going against my schema, and I come into what we call a cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance was started by Festinger in 1957, and cognitive dissonance is very important in interpersonal communication as well as mass communications. Because if you think about what cognitive dissonance is and what that word means, it's basically your thinking and being in a state of dissonance, being in a state of disruption. When we are faced with information, if it goes against our schema, our beliefs, our understanding, we get in this area of dissonance. And we really want to be consistent in our cognition. So we're quickly trying to go back to this level of dissonance, okay? It's psychologically uncomfortable for us to be out of our zone. And so it motivates us highly to go back to that level of dissonance. So it motivates people to achieve this sort of constance of themselves. And in fact, if you are in a state of dissonance, you're going to avoid information, you're going to avoid situations that are going to increase that dissonance. So if I'm in a situation where, let's say, an activist is coming up and talking to me about how I take care of my sheep and telling me things, I'm quickly going to go into an uncomfortable level of dissonance because they're saying things that I don't necessarily agree with. And so I'm either going to try and walk away to avoid that situation and bring myself back up. I'm going to try and argue my situation to bring myself back up. We see this a lot with media. If information is handed to you that you do not agree with, you're going to avoid it. You're going to not take that information, you're not going to remember that information. So when we think about groups and interpersonal communication, especially when we think about changing organizations, if we're putting people in a state of dissonance, how do we level that off and help them level that off without making them avoid, making them forget? So we really have to work in that. And part of that then goes into their attention. When we think about attention, the way people have attention to things, first is that encoding, taking in the information and making sense of it, but then there's that consciousness and awareness of the intention. So what comes into that is our schema comes into that. So is this object going to catch our attention because it agrees with our schema? Is it going to keep us in a state of cognitive levelness? A lot of times when we look at external objects that capture our attention, they're going to have causal attributions. And some of these can be exaggerated in our mind because they don't necessarily go with our views, or they do go with our views. And our evaluations of things can be very polarized based on what that schema and what our beliefs and awareness is. So when we talked about the State of the Union, your evaluation of the State of the Union can be very polarized based on your stance on governmental politics and your understanding and awareness of government politics. And a lot of that, again, is then going to come into the idea of self-identity. And Baumeister, and this is the other reading that I gave you, I think is really important as we think about communications. Self-identity is sort of an interpersonal tool that helps us make choices and sort of helps us regulate ourself. When we think about self, every information related to ourself, we tend to remember better. And if information isn't referenced to us, we don't necessarily remember it, okay? We interpret events that are going to help us increase our good qualities. So if you think about it, so self-identity is social interaction with yourself. We interpret events to increase our good qualities. We tend to overestimate our good qualities and are more optimistic about them than more optimistic when somebody goes against them. And we see this a lot of times. Higher self-esteem people will tend to take greater risks. But that self-identity then comes back into when we talk about, our personal schema and what we believe in ourselves. And then the one last theory that we want to take into consideration as we think about interpersonal communications is the uncertainty theory. And we're going to see this a lot when we are working with groups, extension groups, workshops, those kinds of things. You're going to come into this effect where people don't know you, and so there's sort of this uncertainty on how they trust you, sort of that pathos idea again. So there's 3 phases that people go through when they're uncertain and when they meet somebody. There's sort of the entry phase where they're just scoping out who you are, what you are, looking at you from afar, observing, and then, saying hello, sort of that basic entry level information. Just sort of communication rules and basic norms, how's the weather, that kind of stuff. As the discussion moves into more of attitudes, beliefs, more personal data, do you have any children? What do you think about this issue? That's when we're in the sort of that personal phase. And that's where we're going to, it's a lot less constrained by rules. We can get more information put out. And then you'll go through that exit phase. And the exit phase then is going to be planning for the next interaction and future interactions. So as you look at uncertainty and when people are trying to feel out others, there's a couple strategies they'll take. There's sort of that passive strategy where if you think about yourself sitting in a class, before you talk to the person next to you, you may just observe them. You may be passive. You may just see what they do, see who they talk to, what notes are they taking, before you decide to make that relationship and that communication. You then may go into sort of an active stage, to reduce that uncertainty about that person, where not necessarily you're talking to that person, but you're looking at their Facebook page, you're talking to your friends. Do you know so and so? You're talking to their friends. Can you tell me something about them? To help reduce that uncertainty about that person. And then lastly is when you really will go in interactively and talk to that person. And that then begins sort of more of that entry and personal and exit phases. And all of these things are going to become important as we think about how we integrate, or how we do interpersonal communications, and how we talk about mass communications and how we build relationships in order to work through people's self-identity, work through their schemas, their cognitive dissonance, to get our messages across. See you guys next week.